So you were talking about
Mm,
gym bro. It's become an insult. Gym bro,
it has.
tech bro, right wing bro, whatever. I mean, that relates to the fact that it does seem that it's quite threatening to someone that men should, particularly young men, particularly young fit men, should
Mm,
freely associate. Why is that a
yeah.
scary idea to some people? It seems like the most natural thing in the world, brotherhood, surely.
Yeah, well, I think maybe a better word for it is friendship, male friendship. So I was in, as you mentioned in the introduction, I was in a documentary, a Tucker Carlson documentary called The End of Men in 2022 about testosterone decline. I was actually one of the main stars of this of the documentary, along with RFK Jr., who is now head of Health and Human Services. I mean, he's taken on a huge role in this Make America Healthy Again agenda. That's a central kind of plank of Trump 2.0. But the documentary was about testosterone decline, primarily about the precipitous decline in testosterone levels that's taken place across the developed world since we've been measuring testosterone, certainly sort of 50, 70, maybe even 100 years. Testosterone decline has been taking place at a level of something like 1% a year. I mean, it's precipitous, and it's part of a broader reproductive decline, sperm counts in particular. Sperm counts are plummeting. It's all kind of wrapped up together. But the first part of the documentary was about the nature of the problem and the causes, exposure to harmful chemicals, endocrine disruptors. Those are hormone disrupting chemicals. So they're basically in everything: personal care products, food, the water, the air. They're everywhere. Microplastics, PFAS, phthalates, BPA, all this kind of stuff. But then the second part of the documentary was about me and about people like me, so-called right-wing bodybuilders who are kind of bucking the trend, kicking against the pricks, and trying to do something about testosterone decline, about the kind of pervasive toxicity of the modern world, and working out, uh, eating animal food diets, doing all sorts of crazy stuff.
Crazy far right ideas like
Yes,
being outside and eating eggs and going to the gym,
yeah,
right?
and hanging out, and surrounding yourself with other like-minded men who encourage you to be better, not to be a passive consumer, all this kind of stuff. And what was very interesting about the documentary actually was the reaction from the liberal media. So there was a trailer that dropped in, I think it was April of 2022, and then the documentary was September or October. But when the trailer dropped, I mean, it broke the internet for about, like 15 minutes. I mean, it really did. And all these liberal commentators in the US, Joy Behar, George Takei, Stephen Colbert, they were all talking about this trailer and saying, "Oh, it's incredibly gay. It's so homoerotic. All of these ideas. It's gay fascism. It's Tucker Carlson's kind of repressed sexuality coming out. It's all this kind of stuff." And actually, it's very interesting the way that this kind of homosexual slur is
Mm,
used when men get together to do stuff. So
right.
there's a very famous essay or series of essays by C.S. Lewis called Four Types of Love, where he talks about, among other things, friendship as one of four types of love. And there's this devastating quote where he says, I can't remember the exact words, but he says something like, "Those who confuse friendship with eros, i.e., sexual love, betray the fact that they have never had a real friend themselves." This was written in the 1940s, right? And C.S. Lewis is saying, look, you're making a mistake if you think that male friends are all secretly gay. Well, so I mean, it's a slur that's been used for a long time, and it has very specific effects. It's intended to discourage men from associating with
Yes.
one another. It's intended to make men retreat from each other. And so what do you end up with? Well, you end up with these kind of like really sad last kind of holdouts of masculinity, like the man cave, where this kind of isolated man, husband probably with kids, goes to his man cave and sits and plays video games, and it's like that's the one last space that he's got to be a man.
Mm.
So I mean, I actually wrote an essay about this in American Mind, a journal, Claremont Institute, about how this slur is used and why it's used. And I do think it is used very deliberately to deter men from associating with one another, because people understand actually that male friendship is a revolutionary force, or it certainly can be.
Yes.
When men who are bound together by a kind of shared code, by loyalty, by a shared sense of honor, uh, striving towards some particular goal, that could be that can flip a society on its head. I mean, there's actually no limit to what groups of determined
Mm-hmm.
men can do together. And I do think that it is actually, yes, it is actually seen as a kind of revolutionary threat. I think that the system works, the kind of system of modern kind of liberal consumerism works basically on people being passive consumers. And men who take control of their lives, who don't just eat processed food and watch pornography and sit in all day watching Netflix and Star Wars films, and actually take control of their lives. And they're not passive consumers anymore. They don't just receive values, they're actually projecting their values out onto the world and potentially changing things.
Yes.
So I think yeah, I mean, I think these people, whether they know it or not explicitly, they sense the threat. They sense the
Yeah, yeah.
threat that actually men who aren't these, like passive losers, are a potentially a threat to the system. So that's why I think uh, brotherhood, but to give it its proper name, friendship, is so heavily discouraged in the modern world, especially by liberals.
Yes, yeah, and it doesn't have to be conspiratorial. It can be sort of
No.
an instinct against it, a
Mm,
dislike, or an action. So, for example, testosterone levels, to return to that, 1% doesn't sound like much, but cumulatively, I've heard you say in other interviews that means that, in a very short number of years, the mean sperm count will be zero. So this is an
yes,
existential threat to humanity. There is
it is.
a sperm-shaped meteor heading towards the planet, right? There's
Mm,
a literally a humanity-ending threat, but because it's masculine, we're sort of okay with it. Like if instead everyone's testosterone was going too high to reproduce,
mm, yeah,
something would be done pretty fucking quickly, I think. If it was like, oh,
yeah.
men's testosterone's doubled in the last 20 years, this is going to
Mm,
be, because obviously, too high testosterone may cause issues as well, in certain parts of the population. Women are no longer able to reproduce because their testosterone's too
mm.
high or whatever. So, I mean, if that was the case, something would just be done. But we're sort of okay as a society with
Yeah.
men disappearing. So it doesn't have to be conspiratorial. It can just be
No.
inaction, right?
Yeah, I mean, yes, it's an interesting thing. It turns out that basically all industrial chemicals, all herbicides, all pesticides, all of these chemicals that are in personal care products that we're exposed to on a daily basis, that are affecting our hormone levels. Unfortunately, it turns out that all of them seem to be, or most of them, the vast majority, seem to be estrogenic. That's just a fact. That isn't, nobody's done that on purpose. It just seems to be the case that, all plasticizers, all herbicides, pesticides, whatever, they mimic the effects of the female hormone estrogen in the body. And so they have, uh, you might say, like masculinity sapping consequences. They also have very negative consequences for women as well, and that's
Mm.
something that absolutely shouldn't be minimized. Excess of estrogen is bad for women too. It's very bad, in fact, and it's just as dangerous to female health, to female fertility, as it is to male fertility. You have to have a specific ratio of testosterone to estrogen if you're a woman or a man, and anything that really seriously unbalances that will affect your health. But yes, I mean, it's an interesting kink of the modern world that actually all of these chemicals are estrogenic. And I've said, like you just said, I think things would be very, very different if all of these chemicals were actually androgenic and they were making men more aggressive, more assertive, um, you know, getting men up off the sofa rather than making them sit down. It would, I, the problem wouldn't have been allowed to get, I think, to this stage if actually, one of the kind of intrinsic effects of the modern industrial world was to make men less passive, more thrusting, etc. But as it happens, it's the opposite, and I think that kind of chemical assault on our bodies just from a systemic perspective, it tends to the maintenance of the system rather than to challenging it. So nothing
Hmm. Hmm.
happens, of course.